This podcast is supported by the Oxford Method, an online UK university preparatory program designed to successfully prepare international students for Britain's top universities. As a patron of the show, you can get up to 40% off their over 30 course options, as well as their university preparatory services. In addition to those crazy discounts, you also get access to extra bonus episodes, patron-only content, ad-free episodes, and much more. So why wait around? Head over to patreon.com/coffee and cocktails podcast and sign up today. Now, on with the show. Hello, and welcome to the 39th episode of Coffee and Cocktails. I'm your host, Dr. Ann Wand, and welcome to our new series, Giving Voice to the Voiceless, where today we have the pleasure of talking with Eugenia Aguilar Nova, who will be talking with us about her work concerning inequality, wages, and working conditions in Mexico. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Anne. Thank you very much for having me. I'm really excited to be here in CNC.
It's a pleasure. As per usual, we'll start off by having you tell us what drink you were having for the show, followed by a little bit about yourself. Eugenia, would you like to start?
I'm Mexican born, and I started working in science, technology, and innovation, always thinking of technical stuff to make the world better. Eventually, I moved to Sussex University to do a master's degree in management of innovation. And funnily enough, I ended up working on entrepreneurship and development. And this took me around the Middle East and Africa. And eventually I came back to my country where I thought I could do some work, especially in the South. Throughout my years in England, I tried to explain to people how Mexico, although it's a high middle income country, had different realities, really. But I didn't manage to portray or really explain what was happening. And now I understand, because I came back to my country, trying to apply all the knowledge I had about development and innovation and how this can drive society. And I just came to realize that I didn't know my own country myself.
Interesting. So what led you initially to wanting to raise awareness about the inequality in Mexico? I know that you said you were born in Oaxaca, but then you came back, and one of the things we talked about previous discussions was there's this perception of the poverty levels and the issues with regards to, drug issues and slave trade, et cetera, and people going missing. You'd mentioned that there were a lot of issues. And I think in talking to you, I'd heard these stories, but a lot of times I always thought it was a bit of an exaggeration, or maybe, stories to kind of prevent some people from going to certain places. Could you tell us a bit about the area where you lived and kind of how that led to the research and work that you're doing now?
Okay, so, when I came back to Mexico, I didn't come to Oaxaca, which is in the southern part of Mexico, and historically is one of the three most impoverished states of the country. So I didn't come here, and I didn't grow up here either. I grew up in the center of the country, and that's where I went back. I went back to Mexico City and started to work. And while I was working, I was reminded of many things. First of all, the working conditions, like you have to work Monday to Saturday, 8 hours every day. And I knew that because I had worked before in Mexico, but I'd been abroad for 12 years in Europe. And Europe is like the heaven of working conditions in comparison to the rest of the world.
Yeah. On paper, by the way, on paper.
I don't know why someone would quit that to come back to, to one of the places that
I know we miss you.
6 days holidays. Oh my God. Yeah. So anyway, I went to Mexico City. I was doing my work. I realized I had less freedom of time in how using my time, and how this had an implication in progressing my career, to have more time to develop, to entertain yourself, to have family time, friends time. Eventually, what I decided to do was a social enterprise. And this social enterprise was a business I had in mind even before going to Europe about 15 years ago. And this was working with artisans from indigenous regions from Oaxaca, the place where I am from. And I had all these great ideas about development because I had worked in different projects worldwide. But this time I wasn't doing it in an institutionalized way. I was doing individually. And this led me to come to Oaxaca to develop and work with the artisans. And 90% of them were women. And to visit the places. So I started to get to know the place because before I used to travel to all the touristic places, which are beautiful and so easy to access. And then I started to go to roads that take forever, for 400 kilometers, I don't know, 250 miles. It takes you 8 hours, right? So, and that's when I realized about the great difference. In Mexico City, I could realize because some people cannot pay, well, the rent that I used to pay are kind of 2 salaries of the average person. So I realized there was a lot of inequality, and I kept on using the public transport, but that was painful, really painful. And well, I won't get into that, but I started to realize that although Mexico City is one of the best places where to live in Mexico, there was a lot of inequality. And after starting to visit places, little towns and communities in Oaxaca is when I came to realize the stark difference that there is. I guess my interest, to make a long response short, came from, first of all, living it under my own skin after coming back and realizing the difference between salaries, wages, and living standards that I myself was experiencing. And then by the observation of the city, I think using public transport in unequal places is a great tool to actually realize what's happening around. And visiting the communities, that was, I think, one of the strongest experiences for me.
No, definitely. And I think, one of the things that we talked about, and you gave me quite a lot of really interesting information, which will be available in the show notes on our website after we post this, is you talked about how there is a link between the inequality in Mexico and the history of the country, especially over the past 200 years. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. Well, what happens with Mexico nowadays is the 16th largest economy in the world, but it's the 12th most unequal in the world as well. And this, as you mentioned it, has a history. It is true that actually we are seeing a trend on how living standards are dropping around the world in comparison to what happened in the past 3 decades. So this is something that is happening in Mexico as well. The difference, I would say, lies in that Mexico has been unequal throughout its entire life as an independent country. Okay, so the war to gain independence lasted 21 years. So you can imagine a country after 21 years of war is totally ravaged and impoverished.
And when was this? Could you let us know?
1821.
Okay.
Where is it? Yeah, 1821.
Okay.
So after this, Mexico went into a lot of poverty. What happened during colonization is that there was extreme poverty, yes, but there was extreme poverty for small number of people that were at the lowest socioeconomic ranking, let's say. Let's remember that back then there was slavery. So one of the first things that we managed to get as an independent country was the abolition of slavery. And that, in that sense, Mexico has been quite a progressive country because we managed to get like some of the best laws passed through very early on. We're not so good at enforcing them. However, what happened is we had this mobility in the wages, and slavery was abolished, but the land was ravaged and impoverished. There weren't any kind of practical means as to make production happen. And although the wages were regularized, how could I say it, homogenized?
Okay.
Nominally they were, but actually they weren't. If we look at studies comparing the living standards of Mexico City with London 200 years ago, 250 years ago, just to make sure that we get into the differentiation between colonization and independence, skilled workers had pretty much the same living standards as Londoners.
Okay.
And that even, so the poverty and inequality comes when we're talking about unskilled labor. Yeah.
Okay.
And when we go there, we see that although the wage is nominally raised in comparison to what a person could afford, like the basic basket, we call it, for feeding themselves and getting housing, it decreased. So the living standards were going down, 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 down. And something that happens after gaining independence is civil war, because everyone is starting to try to understand how the country is going to be ruled. And yeah, I guess the internal negotiations that didn't exist before start happening. So we had this civil war just 30 years after gaining independence. And this civil war lasted about 18 years as well.
Wow.
Intermittent, but it was quite long.
Okay.
And obviously, what happens during war is that, again, you have the land ravaged, all your production means are gone, and you have more poverty. So it's funny because while we appreciate in the world, like after the second industrial revolution came, how can let me go back. Let me just explain this. What happens when there's a technological innovation that disrupts and changes the rules of the game? What happens first is that there are big winners and big losers. And there's a degrowth, let's say it. There are kind of, there's instability because people don't know what's going to happen. But after the innovation or this technological change matures and people understands it, then the economic growth booms.
Okay.
And that's when we're supposed to have the big winners having their winnings spreading out throughout the population, right? So that's one of the assumptions. And in Mexico, that did not happen because at the time that there was this booming throughout the second industrial revolution, we were in war. So we didn't manage to gain the benefits of this. After that, this war was settled. Then we had war with France and with the US. And Mexico lost about half of its territory throughout those wars. So
we're talking like the country of Texas. They like to say country of Texas. We're talking about parts of Texas, parts of California. Is that correct?
Yes, it's everything, like from Arizona, even Nebraska. I mean, it's
New
just kind of
Mexico. Yeah.
really. The thing is, there was a lot of upheaval trying to make things happen. So let's say at some point it's like Mexico was recovering and being productive, and another shock came. And usually the shock was war.
Okay.
Right. So that's why we have where I'm going is that throughout these 200 years of independence, we have not managed to actually decrease the inequality. So we have been missing on gaining the benefits of these big global changes, but we are managing to absorb the opposites. When that the actual trend on raising inequality and decreasing living standards, that's something that we are actually picking up.
Mm-hmm. So basically, if I understand it correctly, since colonialism has sort of ceased in the country, the standard or the rise of inequality has gone up. Would you say that that's accurate?
Um, in general terms, yes, absolutely. We have different changes. We have a president that lasted 30 years, approximately 30 years. And with him, we have his name is Porfirio Diaz, and he's been mistreated, I'd say, throughout history because he was a dictator. He was a de facto dictator. In Mexico, we have never had dictatorship, you see, but our fellow Latin Americans call us the perfect dictatorship because we have elections that were invalid or not as transparent as one would like them to be. And you keep on having the same people in power for long periods of time. And so we have this guy, Porfirio Diaz. His first 18 years were amazing. Yeah. And that's something that not a lot of Mexicans would say. But he brought a lot of infrastructure. He paid the debts. He managed to keep the country safe and healthy. And then what happened to him, I guess, is what happens to a lot of people who consider themselves the best and the only ones who can rule. And yeah, the last years of the Porfiriato. So a sharp losing of living conditions for the very unskilled people. So for the bottom 40%. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But although in history, we don't even want to mention him as someone who actually managed to do something good for the country, he managed to have this 40% of people in poverty, dire poverty, I'd say. But now we have 40% of people living in extreme poverty, nearly 20% in poverty, and another 20% vulnerable to fall into poverty at any minute.
Yeah. And let's talk. Yeah, I was going to say, let's talk about that a little bit. Because in your work, you say that 50% of Mexican society has been living in poverty for the past 30 years, and that 40% of full-time employees cannot even afford to buy basic food for their families. Can you explain, you talked about this dictatorship, but can you explain why nowadays this is persistent?
Yeah, I think something that is really important. Well, there are two main points here. One is that nominal wages in Mexico have been stagnant for 30 years. As a personal anecdote, when I left to Europe, I was having, I don't know, let's say £1,000 salary.
Okay.
To make it easy. I left. I was away for 15 years. And when I came back, and I had 15 years of experience, and I had a master's degree, and I had so many things under my pocket in my career, They were offering me the same.
Wow.
So that was personal anecdote. So I started to research to try to understand what was happening. And I started to ask friends, members of family, relatives, what was happening with them. And then it's like, oh, wow, yeah, the salaries were stagnant. And that was just a personal appreciation. Then I turned into researchers, economists that actually were working on that. And effectively, that's what happened. 30 years of stagnation. The only way to go up the ladder was actually having an executive position or a better off position. But as you may know, these positions are very few. So that's what is happening to the professional middle class. Then I wanted to know what was happening with the unskilled or bottom people at the bottom of the ladder. And that's when I realized that wages have been stagnant. Actually, that's what has happened. Now, in Mexico, as well as in Latin America, there's a lot of informality. Yeah, about 60% of the working force work informally.
How many? You said 60%?
Yeah, it's that high. It's that high.
Wow.
Informality means that you don't have welfare, you don't have access to health systems, you don't have access, you don't have a secure household, and that you don't have means to retire. You need to keep working throughout your whole life because you are not going to have a way to stop working, So what happens here is like, if you go to the supermarket, we still have people that help you to pack your stuff. It's not because it's a necessary work. It's because the people who are there are 65 plus. And that's the job they can do. And that's how they make money, like with the tips of people who give them something for packing up their groceries. So,
wow.
So this is on informality. But first, we're talking about the wages. And then the other point are working conditions. Why informality is so high? And I think part of it is because the working conditions are not helpful. First of all, you have to work 6 days a week, 48 hours, 8 hours every day. Yeah. And then you will have extra hours that, according to the law, they are supposed to be optional. And if you take them, if a worker takes them, they are going to be paid 3 times the regular wage. That does not happen. And then also, it wasn't until 5 months ago that the law changed, but also in Mexico, we only had 6 days of holiday per year. That meant 1 week because you had to work for 6 days a week. So you work a whole year and you get 1 week of holiday.
And that's for everybody across the board, no matter what. If you're unskilled, you're middle income, everybody is the same.
Yeah, for professionals, informally, you have this kind of rule where instead of getting 1 week, you got 2. And you could consider yourself extremely lucky.
Wow.
So it changed, thankfully, 5 months ago. And now we have 2 weeks holiday for across the board for everybody. But first of all, is that Mexico is one of the countries where you have least women working. And why is this? Because there's not access to healthcare. There's not access to childcare. So if you don't have these things and you have children, you are unable to work 48 hours. Even less so if your boss is going to tell you, I need you to stay for 3 more hours.
Yeah.
So I think it's a very interesting dynamic about how you use your time and what the time allows you to do.
It's uh, it's a lot to process because I think about single parents, like how would you even do that? If there's no necessarily like any subsidies put in place. um it does make me wonder, in an economy where you do need able-bodied people, how how can this continue? How can this be a persistent way of living if it's essentially discouraging people from producing the next generation, if there's no support systems put in place?
Well, what happens is, there are studies made here in Mexico about how women manage to do that, to raise children.
Mm,
Because yeah, most of the work relies on the woman, and in this case, that's one of the responses to informality. People just work on the side because they can manage their time. They can
mm,
go and pick up their children. And first of all, they rely on the grannies, the
yeah,
grandpas,
yeah.
the other friends that work informally and maybe can look after your child one day and you look after their children another day.
Mm,
But that's why there's informality. One of the reasons, there are many reasons, that's one of them. But also, what the studies show is women that are unskilled tend to get pregnant earlier on.
okay.
And it's this cycle of how you use your time and how you make your decisions. Because if early on they start looking at taking on the childcare that the state that is absent with the state, then women cannot keep on studying. And if they had studied, they cannot work formally. And
Mm,
even if they have made quite a few things advancing their career, usually they are not to be taken into account. There's some professionals that work on the side for people that pay them, but would not give them credit.
which I think kind of gets into sort of this next question. We've talked about the working conditions and the poor working conditions, and now the majority of formal jobs in Mexico are, as you would call it, not great, let's say, in terms of what the working conditions are. um could you explain to us, a little bit about, you said that people sort of negotiate, right? I watch your kid, you'll watch my kid, and that's for those that are maybe at home with children. But it strikes me that there's a sense of, and we've talked about this before, of people being used to being exploited and possibly they sort of navigate the system to the best of their ability. Would you say that that's accurate?
Yeah, I think we have to realize what, yes, you said it perfectly. Some people say why they choose to do that, but they don't choose. They just navigate the best they
Mm,
can, that kind of water. Um, I wouldn't be able to say culturally or which are the underlying values. It's
mm,
that rules the country to actually say why people are so used to exploitation.
mm,
Um, but definitely, there's a trend. There are some sayings, like if you don't stay after hours and take on more responsibility that is going to be unpaid, simply you're not pulling your weight. And that's not only your boss telling, it's your colleagues saying as well.
yeah.
So it's kind of generalized. And also we have in Mexico, we are strong advocates of meritocracy. It's kind of, if someone is poor, it's because they want to, because there's work. So if they are poor, it's because they don't want to work. So
Okay.
I think that's quite subtle in the sense that if you had not had experience this kind of realities, it might be difficult, When I started to work, I was well off, let's say. Yes, I only had 2 weeks holiday, but I had 2 weeks holiday, which was amazing for your first job, in under Mexican rules. I had a good salary. I could afford quite a few things. Um, and I thought, okay, but I've been working hard. I had sleepless nights. I had to do quite a few things. I volunteered to do a number of activities so I could kind of, I was always curious and interested in doing things. So I thought, well, but I have a good profile because of all these activities. So I thought I worked my way through, right? But now, when I went to visit different communities in Oaxaca, it's like, oh, you know, uh, I could wake up at 5 in the morning and just go and get water from the river, or go and cut wood to cook, which is very different from, oh, I'm going to be reading, doing my newspapers, homeworks, and projects. It's very different. Um, so I think there's this narrative, and also this big divide in which you don't get to see straight the realities of other people, or better said, you are raised, or at least I was raised, in a society where you have different neighborhoods. As if you were in London, you could be in Chelsea, and then you go, I don't know, somewhere where there's knife crime, and but you just don't go. So it's the same. I was raised that way, and I was used to so many things because I grew up with them. So I wouldn't not question them. It's just how things are. And I guess part of the inequality thing in Mexico is that we were born in inequality, we grew up in inequality, and we just don't know anything different.
So would you say that there's almost like an acceptance?
Yes, it's not an acceptance. It's more kind of an acceptance of the narrative that Mexico is an industrious country, is not a poor country, and therefore, if you want to work hard, you will be well. But we have not realized, a lot of the population have not realized that the opportunities or the way you can work your way through are different, or that not everybody is going to get as far as everybody
The
else.
same available options. Like some of us might be able to just turn on the tap to get our water as opposed to having to go down to a river to do those sorts of things.
Exactly. Just to give you a number, social mobility is this term that we used to see how much children move on the socioeconomic ladder in comparison to their parents. So if you divide the population of Mexico in five, from the lowest to the highest, in the bottom 20%, we have 49 people who live in poverty. And from these 49 people who live in poverty, only 13 will be able to move from extremely poor to poor. So that's telling you kind of, if you are born poor, you may end up living poor your entire life. And that's kind of not only scandalous, but it's really worrying if we look at the amount of people who live in poverty now.
Mm-hmm. Would you say that inequality in Mexico today is institutionalized?
Absolutely. For yes, what I've just mentioned, I think there's kind of this assumed narrative that is not entirely correct, that we have assumed and that we kind of adopt unconsciously. And it's quite difficult to make a move, a change on that mentality, especially if you are on the top 20% that is not poor and not vulnerable. And then, of course, there's the middle class that's this small amount of people who manage to move from vulnerable to not vulnerable, which had certain advantages, to be able to get there. Of course, they had to work hard, but they had some differences, or clear differences, in comparison to the rest 60% of the population. So there's this culturally ingrained narrative, as well as the system, that if the system is, yes, we didn't get into that, but it's true. I was mentioning 60% of the workforce in Mexico, approximately. It will be kind of 55%, perhaps. I don't have the exact number right now on me. Works in informality. And then you have the ones who work formally. From these ones, by law, you are supposed to have the retirement plan, access to healthcare, and access to decent housing, right? So the health public service is in shambles, and a lot of people don't trust it. First of all, so you don't value it that much. But then, even if you value it, there's a big amount of employers who hire you and pay you, but don't give you the social welfare, which is housing, retirement, and health.
So then how do you prepare for those things? Do you just have to create your own separate account and save up, if you can even do that?
If you are able to do that, of course you do that. And that's what happens. If you are able to pay 6 minimum wages, which is the equal to that, so 6 minimum wages, you are able to retire and to have a well-off retirement. But then imagine what type of person are you, so you can save 6 minimum wages while you're still spending and making your life. So it's pretty much inaccessible to most people. But the other thing is, how do you involve women? How do you involve women in the workforce? Because we are 50% of the population, 50% of the population, and we are one of the countries where women activity in the workforce is quite low. And this is precisely because childcare is not institutionalized. So if you don't have support to look after children, then you have to have, again, the economic differential where you can afford to pay for your children's care. So I would say that's part of being institutionalized. Apart from that, imagine if two parents are, there's not a lot of part-timing in Mexico. Not a lot of part-timing. So if a woman wants to work and to make enough money, so it's worth the effort, has to do the 48 hours. So how do you manage to have your children, well looked after? There's so many women that are tried through this informal market of relatives and friends to look after each other's children. But how safe is that? Yeah. How safe in the first place? What kind of quality could you offer to these children in the development of their abilities and capacities? So I would say that these are kind of things that actually institutionalized inequality.
It seems, from what you're telling me, it just seems quite cyclical. And I think it sort of gets back into this idea of, these are the cards we've been dealt. So how do we work our way around this to the best of our abilities so we can keep a roof over our head and keep our kids fed and safe and everything else?
Well, there are quite a few things going on. If we're talking about a stagnation of wages, then we have to talk about increasing wages. And and that may seem obvious, but it's not that obvious, because if you increase wages, let's say the employers are going to lose on their profit, right? So what's happening now, I don't know if you have heard about Isabel Weber. She's an economist who is making the news these days because she's been talking about greedflation. And she's saying that inflation has been has been studied in the wrong way, because actually it's not the cost of labor or the cost of inputs that are making inflation happen. But it's greedflation. It's just the greed for profit. It's kind of, we're not going to lose anything on our profit, although we have a big, big profit. So it's kind of, let's say in a very gross way, if you are having 1,000% profit, why wouldn't you be happy with 900% profit? Why do you have to level up again the prices for the public if you get an increase of wages? So first of all, I think first when there's a stagnation of wages and the wages are not good enough for paying your basic food, never mind housing, never mind clothing, never mind education, but just food. You are working 48 hours a week and you cannot pay the food of your family. It's adamant. It's really important to raise wages. And the second thing is, when you have this level of poverty, which is very high and it's historical, you don't break, you know how things are path dependency. You take a path and then it's quite difficult to kind of change paths or to So part of it is having the programs that are anti-poverty and developing abilities, But how are you going to develop abilities if your mom is unemployed and looking after you and working in informality, and you never see your dad because he's working 48 hours a week, and the schools are not great, It's like pretty much the top 20% of population the population at the top 20% have studied in different schools. Maybe university in a public university because they have good standard. But you have to have kind of high school and middle school and primary school in a private school, so you can compete and get the good spaces in the public university, or to pay for your good private university. So we're finding that cash transfers actually work. And in Mexico, we have, in the past 4.5 years, we have had a massive increase in cash transfers. And this could sound like a good idea if you focalize and you really address them into the households that most need it. The problem is that although the increase has been amazing, really, it's been huge, what is happening is that it's going to the households that are on the, not the poorest ones, not the extreme poverty ones, not the poverty ones, but going to the vulnerable ones, and sometimes even to the top 20%. So there's a real need to actually to focalize these cash transfers, because it's an expensive it's an expensive public mechanism, and it's okay as long as it is an investment that is going to have an effect on the people we really want to support. But if it's not doing that, then it's more than an investment. It could end up as an expenditure. And as an expenditure that is not going to have an impact and could just end up in, and we don't know. We don't know where it goes. Or if your money doesn't do what you want it to do. So I don't know if that kind of response, and part of it as well, the support for women for childcare, to actually not be in Mexico. It's quite normal to receive questions such as, "Are you married? How old are you? Oh, you are on the age that you may want to have children." So those are all big red lights and big no-nos, because then even if you have a certain age and you don't want to have children yet, you may not be offered the job because you are a woman in an age to have children.
Yep.
So if we want to have this 50% of the population going through the workforce and being productive and active and satisfied, yes, a lot of support for women.
Absolutely. If we could round this up with one final question. You said to me some time ago that the Mexican government has a slogan, and that slogan is "the poor first." What steps should the Mexican government be taking, in your opinion, in order to follow through on that particular slogan?
Well, I think, first of all, is what I mentioned, change in working conditions, as in working hours, and enforcing that people is ensured with well-being, with housing, health, access to health services, and retirement plans. Secondly, the support for women in vulnerable places and in indigenous communities are the most marginalized. Many of them have not even finished primary school, and like 70% of the population in Oaxaca just finished, don't even have secondary school. So there's a lot of, they need to improve the services, education services, health services, childcare services. There's a lot of people that if they feel ill, immediately they fall into poverty. They fall into poverty because if working, you cannot have savings. You stop working, and what happens to you? And then the cash transfers, as I mentioned, they have to be focalized. And also, some people are promoting a progressive way of paying taxes. Like in Mexico, 2% of the population have around 70% of the wealth of the country. But they're not paying 70% of the taxes. They are kind of, it's about 30%. So if you can have all that wealth, maybe you should pay in a way that is more, that resembles more what you can do. But these are just kind of quite a few ideas. I'm sure a lot of people will have some more specific ideas about what can be done as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there'll be a lot of listeners that will be able to relate to this in some capacity, even if they're not from Mexico. I think that there will be a lot of elements within this in terms of proper, services for women, for those who have children, for those who are in need of health care. I think that is a universal element that is lacking with a lot of governments, that is not being taken as seriously as it needs to be.
Totally, yes.
And I think, with that, I think that, there's a lot of discussions that can be had in future, whether it's, the work that you're doing. And if you're listening and you have, you want to participate in the discussion, or you have questions that you want to give to Eugenia, I'm sure you'd be very happy to talk to them in any capacity about the work that you're doing.
Sure.
And if you'd like those details, feel free to give us, an email, and I'd be happy to pass Eugenia's details on if that's okay with you.
Absolutely. Yeah, that'll be fine. I just want to say one thing. I would be really interested to know what happens in India. It's funny, but we're looking at global trends and country by country studies. Mexico has quite a few similarities with India. So although we seem to be like very different cultures, I don't know if that question about the underlying social values may have something to do with it. So yeah, it will be really interesting to see that.
Well, I think so. And if you're listening, we have an episode with Pragati Gupta, who does a talk with us in episode 38, where she's talking about the caste system and how that is manifested through education and the sort of effects that it can have, and the role that the government plays in possibly perpetuating these negative stereotypes. So I'm sure, that she would be a good person to listen to and possibly talk to in future.
Great.
Yeah. But for now, I have to say that's it from us at Coffee and Cocktails with your host, Dr. Ann Wand. I'd like to thank Eugenia Aguilar Nova for joining us at the studio this afternoon. Additional information on today's topic will be available on our website in the show notes. And if you enjoyed this series and you'd like to check out our bonus content, then consider becoming a patron starting at £1 per month. It's support from our patrons that really helps to keep the show going. By becoming a patron, you get access to extra bonus content, patron-only interviews, panels, workshops, and much more. To join, just head over to patreon.com/Coffee and Cocktails Podcast. Otherwise, that's it for now. Thanks for listening and have a great week.